He refused to participate in the Pride Month initiative. "I was only trying to bring the community into compliance." Ma'am, this has nothing to do with HOA compliance. You are being charged with 3 counts of tampering with federal postal property. I didn't know it was federal property. I just wanted the mailbox painted. Intent doesn't matter here, ma'am. This mailbox is federally protected, and you damaged it 3 separate times. HOA President Barbara Higgins of the Cedar Creek Community Association had declared that every homeowner's mailbox be repainted with a Pride Month design for June, and when a decorated Army veteran on Independence Avenue declined to participate, and calmly explained he had no issue with anyone but simply did not want to alter his own mailbox, she issued him a $300 fine for what she called a failure to support community inclusion standards. Then personally repainted his mailbox herself without his consent when the fine failed to change his mind. Didn't know was that a residential mailbox is federal property protected under United States postal law. That repeatedly tampering with it constituted a federal crime investigated by postal inspectors rather than local police. And that the security footage capturing her second act of vandalism was already in the hands of federal investigators before she ever painted over it a 3rd time. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments or represent with a flag. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. HOA conflicts. Arthur Pendleton, 58, had lived at 3319 Independence Avenue in the Cedar Creek subdivision of Jefferson County, Missouri since 2009. He had spent 24 years in the United States Army, retiring as a master sergeant after tours that took him through some of the most difficult deployments of his career. He was not a man who spoke much about his service, but the small brass eagle mounted beside his front door and the neatly kept flagpole in his front yard told visitors enough without him having to say a word. He was quiet, private, and had spent his retirement years mostly tending his garden and repairing small engines for neighbors who asked. He had never once had a dispute with anyone in Cedar Creek in 15 years of living there. In late May, Barbara Higgins sent out a community newsletter announcing what she described as a voluntary Pride Month initiative. Homeowners were encouraged, the letter said, to paint a small rainbow design on their mailbox posts throughout the month of June as a gesture of community, inclusion, and celebration. The word voluntary appeared twice in the letter. Arthur read it, set it on his kitchen counter, and decided it was not something he wanted to participate in, not because he had any objection to what the design represented or to the people it was meant to celebrate, but because he had never painted anything on his mailbox in 15 years and did not intend to start now. Regardless of the theme, Barbara appeared at his door on the first Saturday of June, clipboard in hand, asking cheerfully whether he had a preferred color palette for his mailbox design. Arthur told her plainly that he would not be participating, but wanted her to know clearly that his decision had nothing to do with any objection to the community or to anyone in it. He told her he respected everyone's right to live as they chose and celebrate what mattered to them. He simply did not want to alter his own mailbox for any campaign, regardless of what it was for. Barbara's expressions shifted from cheerful to cold in the span of a few seconds. She told him participation was strongly expected of every homeowner and that his refusal would be noted. Margaret Vance, 71, who lived directly across the street at 3312 Independence Avenue, was trimming her rose bushes and had heard the entire exchange from her front yard. She had lived in Cedar Creek for 19 years and had watched Barbara operate long enough to know the tone in her voice when she had already decided someone was going to be a problem. 3 days later, a violation notice appeared in Arthur's mailbox, citing Cedar Creek Community Standards Provision 5.4 for failure to comply with an approved community participation initiative, along with a $300 fine. Arthur read the notice, looked up Provision 5.4 in the governing documents, and found it covered exterior holiday lighting schedules. It said nothing about mailbox designs, participation initiatives, or anything resembling what Barbara had cited. He photographed the notice, filed it away, and left his plain mailbox, exactly as it had always been. Arthur did not pay the fine and did not respond to the notice, and Barbara Higgins did not take that well. A second notice arrived within a week. The fine now raised to $600, with a new line stating that continued non-participation would be treated as a pattern of non-compliance with community values and could result in further board action. It still cited provision 5.4. The same section covering exterior holiday lighting that had nothing to do with mailbox designs or seasonal campaigns. Arthur photographed the notice, added it to a folder he kept in his desk drawer, and went back to working on a neighbor's lawnmower engine he had promised to fix that weekend. Barbara brought Arthur's name to the next Cedar Creek board meeting held at the community clubhouse on Maplewood Road, telling the room that a homeowner on Independence Avenue had refused to support the community's inclusion initiative and suggesting that his refusal reflected poorly on the values of CEDALA. The neighborhood. She did not mention that Arthur had explained his reasoning clearly and respectfully. She did not mention that the initiative had been announced as voluntary in her own newsletter. Two residents at that meeting later told Margaret Vance that they found the framing uncomfortable. Since Arthur had never said a single negative thing about anyone, he had simply chosen not to paint his own property. Margaret, increasingly troubled by what she had witnessed and heard, started paying closer attention to Barbara's movements on the street. She noticed Barbara's car parked near Arthur's house on two separate mornings when Arthur was at his weekly appointment at the VA clinic in Springfield. She mentioned this to Arthur, who checked his doorbell camera footage that evening and found something he had not expected. On both mornings, Barbara had walked up to his mailbox with a small paint kit and repainted a section of the post with a rainbow design while he was away. Both times, Arthur had simply repainted the post back to its plain white finish without saying anything to her about it, assuming it was some kind of miscommunication rather than deliberate vandalism. Once he saw the footage clearly, there was no more room for that assumption. Arthur called David Brooks, an attorney he had worked with years earlier during a property boundary dispute with a previous neighbor. David reviewed the footage, the violation of notices, and the incorrect bylaw citation, and told Arthur plainly that what Barbara had done went far beyond an HOA dispute. He explained that Arthur's mailbox, mounted on a post approved for United States Postal Service delivery, was legally classified as federal property, and that anyone who damaged, defaced, or altered it without authorization, including painting on it without the owner's consent, was committing a federal crime regardless of their intentions or their position on an HOA board. David advised Arthur to preserve the footage exactly as it was, avoid confronting Barbara directly, and be prepared for the possibility that she would try again now that her first two attempts had gone unaddressed. He also told Arthur that if it happened a third time, they would be contacting the United States Postal Inspection Service directly rather than dealing with it as a neighborhood matter. Arthur thanked him, hung up the phone, and checked that his doorbell camera battery was fully charged before he left for his next VA appointment the following week. Arthur left for his VA appointment on a Tuesday morning the following week, the same standing appointment Barbara had already noted twice before. David Brooks had advised him to change nothing about his routine since altering his pattern would only tip Barbara off that she was being watched. Arthur drove to Springfield, as he always did, and his doorbell camera, fully charged and recording continuously, stayed pointed at the mailbox exactly as it had for the past 2 weeks. Barbara arrived at 9:47 that morning, parking 2 houses down the way she had before, and walking up to Arthur's mailbox with the same small paint kit tucked under her arm. She worked quickly, applying a rainbow stripe across the post in under 4 minutes, then stepped back to examine her work with what the footage would later show was a satisfied nod, as though she had accomplished something meaningful rather than defaced piece of federal property for the third time. What Barbara did not know was that David Brooks had already submitted the first 2 instances of footage to the United States Postal Inspection Service the week before. along with a formal complaint outlining the pattern of vandalism against a federally protected mailbox. Inspector Carter had reviewed the footage, confirmed the mailbox's Postal Service approval status, and had already begun building a federal case before Barbara ever picked up her paintbrush that third morning. Arthur returned from his appointment just after 11, and Margaret Vance was waiting on her porch across the street, having watched the entire third incident unfold in real time. She had recorded it on her own phone as an additional angle. Arthur checked his doorbell footage, confirmed what had happened, and forwarded the new clip directly to David, who forwarded it to Inspector Carter within the hour. 2 days later, Inspector Carter and a second postal inspector arrived at Barbara Higgins' home with a federal warrant. She answered the door, still in her HOA polo shirt, confused at first about why federal agents were standing on her porch instead of local police. Inspector Carter explained plainly that she was being placed under arrest for repeated destruction of United States postal property, a federal offense that had nothing to do with HOA authority and everything to do with a law she had never once considered before she picked up that paintbrush the first time. Barbara Higgins was charged with 3 separate counts of destruction of United States postal property, a federal offense that carried the possibility of fines and prison time far more serious than any HOA penalty she had ever issued to anyone else. The footage from Arthur's doorbell camera, combined with Margaret's phone recording of the third incident, gave federal prosecutors a clean, well-documented case with no ambiguity about what had happened or who had done it. Barbara's own explanation to Inspector Carter, that she believed she was simply completing a community initiative, did nothing to change the legal reality that intent does not excuse tampering with federally protected postal property. David Brooks filed a civil suit against Barbara personally the following week, covering the repeated property damage, the improperly issued fines under a bylaw that had nothing to do with mailbox designs, and the public harassment Arthur endured at HOA meetings where his private decision was mischaracterized in front of his neighbors. The Cedar Creek Board called an emergency session once the federal charges became public, and removed Barbara from the presidency by unanimous vote before the meeting reached its first 10 minutes. Every fine issued against Arthur was formally withdrawn, and the board issued a written statement clarifying that the mailbox initiative had always been voluntary and that no homeowner had ever been required to participate. Barbara pleaded guilty to the federal charges months later in exchange for a reduced sentence, and the civil suit settled shortly after, with the terms requiring her to cover Arthur's legal fees and damages related to the vandalism. Arthur's mailbox remains exactly as it always was, plain white, sturdy, and entirely his own decision. Margaret still waters her roses across the street every morning, and the two of them wave at each other the way good neighbors do, without either of them ever needing a mailbox to prove it. If this story hit different, share it with someone who needs to see it, and drop your flag in the comments. HOA conflicts, and we are nowhere near done.